Greetings, everyone. Before we begin, I'd love to know where and what time you're listening from. Let me know in the comments. And if you enjoy our stories, leave a like and subscribe so you never miss one. Now, turn off the lights, close your eyes, and relax. The house smelled of dust, damp plaster, and cheap paint. It was a mixture that clung to clothes and added to the sour smell of milk that Vera, our newborn daughter, seemed to constantly spit up. We were exhausted. My wife Beatrice and I were two empty shells moving by inertia, two sleepwalkers caught in the endless cycle of feeding, changing, and rocking. The lack of sleep was a dense fog that clouded our thoughts and made the world seem distant, unreal. We had moved to that house in the suburbs only a week ago, attracted by a ridiculously low rent and the promise of a yard for our other son, Martin, who was 4. The house was old, much older than the real estate agent had admitted, with creaking floors and drafts that seemed to come from nowhere. Vera's arrival had been hard on Martin. He had gone from being the center of our universe to a secondary figure, a noisy satellite orbiting the silent, demanding sun that was the baby. Beatrice spent her days in a state of half-sleep on the sofa, with Vera glued to her chest. And I, when not at my temporary job, tried to fix up the house, patching cracks, painting walls. Martin, in the middle of this chaos, was forgotten. And he was the one who found it. At first, we were happy that he was quiet. He had stopped throwing tantrums, stopped demanding our attention. He spent hours in his new upstairs bedroom. One afternoon, I went up to check on him. The house was silent, which was rare, as Vera was finally asleep. I found Martin sitting on the floor, his back to me. He was facing the back wall, the one he shared with the old attic space. He was pulling off small pieces of the wallpaper, which was swollen with dampness. "Martin, what are you doing?" I asked. He didn't turn around, he just pointed. "There's a hole, Dad." I approached. He was right. Behind the wallpaper, there was a hole in the plaster. It wasn't a clean hole from a nail or a drill. It was jagged, about the size of my fist, with crumbling edges, as if something had gnawed it from the inside. I knelt down and looked. Inside, there was only darkness and the smell. A cold smell of wet earth and something sweetish like rotten wood. I told him not to touch it, that I would cover it with putty later. I was too tired to be angry. That night we heard Martin talking to himself. It was late. Vera had finally quieted down. Martin's voice was a low, sibilant murmur in the dark. I went to his door. He was sitting on the floor, facing the hole, talking to it. "Who are you talking to, son?" I asked from the doorway. He looked at me, his eyes shining in the dim light. "To my friend," he said, completely naturally. "The little man who scratches." Beatrice and I exchanged an exhausted glance. An imaginary friend. It was normal. The stress of the move, the jealousy over the new sister. It was his way of coping with it. We let him be. But the imaginary friend started giving him things. Martin was delighted. The first gift was a button. He showed it to us at breakfast. It was a large button, made of yellowish mother of pearl, very old. Martin said the little man had pushed it through the hole during the night. I told him it was nice, but not to accept things from the wall. He nodded, not really listening to me. The second gift appeared 2 days later. It was a coin. It was small, black, covered in dirt that wouldn't come off. I couldn't recognize what country or era it was from. It smelled of earth. Martin said his friend had given it to him because he had been a good boy and hadn't cried. Unease began to settle on the back of my neck. I tried to cover the hole. I moved Martin's dresser in front of the wall, but the next morning the dresser was shifted a few inches, just enough for Martin to get his arm behind it. And he had a new gift. That's when the terror began to take shape. He showed me his hand. In his palm was a tooth. Small, sharp, yellowish at the root, like that of a rat or a small carnivore. And it was covered in something dark and dry. I snatched the tooth from his hand. I yelled at him. I asked him where he had gotten it. He just cried and pointed at the dresser. He told me the little man who scratches had given it to him because he was his best friend. That night I moved the dresser and examined the hole again. I put my fingers inside. The wall wasn't thick. Behind it was a hollow space, the space between the ceiling and floor that connected to the attic. The smell of decay was stronger. I shouted into the hole, asking if anyone was there. Only the dead echo of my own voice answered me. I grabbed a powerful flashlight and aimed the light. I didn't see anything, just the dusty interior of the wall, old beams, and crumbled insulation. But as I shone the light, something moved right at the edge of the beam. Something small and fast. A rat, I told myself. We had rats, but Martin's behavior became stranger. He started protecting the hole. He got angry if I went near it, and he started spending time in Vera's room. At first, we thought it was sweet. He would sit on the floor next to the crib watching her. But his gaze was strange, intense, empty. Vera, of course, cried. She cried all the time. Her sharp cry seemed to fill the house, bouncing off the old walls. And then I noticed the connection. Every time Vera cried loudly, we heard a sound coming from Martin's room, a scratching. It wasn't the scratching of a rat. It was a frantic, furious, impatient scratching, like nails or claws raking the inside of the plaster, a sound that seemed to move through the walls following the crying. It would start in Martin's room, go down the hallway, and stop right at the exterior wall of Vera's room. And there it would stay, scratching, scratching, scratching until the baby quieted down. The only thing that seemed to calm it was the sound of running water. The only time the scratching subsided was when Beatrice took a shower. One night, Vera's crying was particularly shrill. I was exhausted, rocking her in the chair, my head spinning. The scratching on the wall was so loud it vibrated under my hand, and then I heard Martin's voice right behind me. "Dad?" I almost dropped the baby. I turned around. Martin was in the doorway, wearing his pajamas, his eyes wide in the dark. He was staring intently at the wall where the scratching came from. "Dad," he whispered, "he's angry." My blood ran cold. "Who is angry, Martin?" "The little man," he said. "He doesn't like the noise, the crying hurts him." The scratching instantly stopped. Silence fell over the room, heavy and absolute. Martin looked at me. His expression was not that of a 4-year-old child. It was cold, calculating. "He says you have to make her quiet, Dad." Before I could answer, Martin turned and went back to his room. I was left alone in the dark with Vera finally asleep in my arms. The silence of the house was now a threat. I decided that the next day I would seal that hole with cement. I would end this madness. But that night, the entity decided it no longer needed to hide. I was awakened by a sound on the baby monitor which we kept on our nightstand. It wasn't Vera's crying, it was a whisper. A dry, sibilant whisper coming from the speaker. Quiet. 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 I jumped out of bed. The video receiver was on. The infrared image showed Vera's crib. And something was wrong. The image was blurred in one corner. I stared at the screen, confused. And then the shape moved. It wasn't a shadow. It was a hand. A small, grayish hand, with long, slender fingers like spider legs, reaching out from the edge of the crib and moving slowly toward my daughter's face. I screamed. I ran down the hall, stumbling in the dark. I burst into Vera's room. I flipped on the light. No one was there. The crib was empty. Panic blinded me. I looked around frantically, and then I heard a noise in the hallway. I ran out. Martin was there. He was standing in front of his open bedroom door, and he was holding Vera in his arms. "Martin, what are you doing? Give me the baby." Martin looked at me. His face was pale, and he was smiling. A strange smile that didn't reach his eyes. The baby was awake but silent, staring at him. "He told me to make her quiet, Dad," Martin whispered. His voice was flat. "He said if she cried again, he would take her away. So I picked her up so she wouldn't make noise." And then Martin turned and walked toward his room, toward the hole in the wall. I lunged at him. I snatched Vera from his arms. The baby, startled, burst into tears, a deafening scream. The instant Vera cried, an inhuman shriek full of rage and pain came from the hole in Martin's wall. a shriek so loud it rattled the window panes, and from the darkness of the hole, I saw something emerge. A long gray hand with black claws that thrashed in the air before disappearing back into the wall. I jerked back, dragging Martine with me, and crashed against the opposite wall of the hallway. My entire body was shaking. The image of that gray hand with its shiny black claws was burned into my retina. The inhuman shriek still echoed in my ears, a sharp sound that seemed to rake the inside of my skull. Vera continued to scream in my arms, her crying now a sound of pure terror. Martine, however, was strangely quiet. He wasn't crying. He only looked at the hole in the wall, now a dark void with an expression of deep disappointment as if his friend had betrayed him. The shriek ceased, but it was instantly replaced by something worse. A frantic scratching. Multiple sources. It sounded as if dozens of small, furious creatures were running in the space between the floors, right above our heads. The sound moved coming down the staircase wall. Beatrice came out of our bedroom, her face pale as wax, her eyes wide with fear. She didn't ask what was wrong. The terror on my face and the noise in the walls were all the answer she needed. I shouted for her to go downstairs. I pushed her in front of me. I grabbed Martine by the arm and dragged him down the stairs with Vera held tight against my chest. The scratching followed us. I heard the sound moving parallel to us inside the staircase wall. It was fast, intelligent. We tumbled into the downstairs living room, tripping over each other. I closed the door to the staircase, a useless gesture. We huddled in the center of the room, as far as possible from any wall. The house, our supposed refuge, had become a trap. The being, the ghoul, the little man who scratches, was no longer a childish fantasy. It was real, it was physical, and it was furious. And it was everywhere. We brought Vera's bassinet into the living room. We brought the baby monitor, although it now seemed like a cruel joke. We created a makeshift camp on the floor, a circle of blankets surrounded by empty space. We didn't sleep. We sat in the dark listening. The scratching stopped, but the silence that remained was tense, expectant. The entire house seemed to be holding its breath. Exhaustion was a poison, and fear was the antidote that kept us awake. But we couldn't keep this up forever. Beatrice was in a state of silent shock, rocking herself, her gaze lost. Martine had fallen asleep on the floor, exhausted by the terror. Only I remained awake, listening, my heart pounding with every creak of the floor. The entity was intelligent. It knew we were terrified, and it knew that its main target, Vera, was still out of reach. So it changed tactics. It started playing with us. The first attack was against Beatrice. She was in the kitchen trying to make some tea, her hands shaking so badly she could barely hold the cup. The scratching started again, this time on the kitchen wall. A rhythmic, slow sound. Scratch. Pause. Scratch. Beatrice froze. The sound was coming from behind the stove. And then the flame on one of the burners, the one she hadn't turned on, lit by itself. A burst of blue gas that shot up almost to the ceiling with a furious hiss. She screamed and dropped the cup, which shattered. I ran to her and turned off the gas valve. It hadn't been an accident. The metal knob was freezing cold, as if it had been turned by a dead hand. The ghoul was demonstrating its control over the house. The electricity started to fail. The lights flickered, not randomly, but to the rhythm of Vera's crying. If the baby whimpered, the lights flickered dimly. If she screamed, they went out completely, plunging us into total darkness that was only broken by Beatrice's frantic shouts. And in that darkness, the scratching became deafening, coming from all the walls at once, surrounding us. But the real horror was still Martine. Isolation and fear began to affect him in new ways. He no longer spoke of the little man as a friend. He spoke of him with fear, but also with a strange familiarity. He would sit in the corner of the living room away from us and whisper to the wall. I heard him asking for forgiveness. I heard him telling the creature that the baby didn't mean to make so much noise. He started drawing. His drawings, once full of suns and smiling houses, were now dark, chaotic. He only used the black pencil, pressing so hard that he sometimes tore the paper. He drew the house, over and over. But the house was wrong. It was twisted, the walls swollen, as if they were sick. And inside the walls he drew figures, small, thin figures with long arms and claws. Hundreds of them. They moved through the hallways he drew inside the walls, like ants in an ant hill, and all their paths led to the same room. The room where a small crib was drawn, surrounded by a furious red circle. Beatrice was breaking down. The lack of sleep, the constant terror, and Martine's transformation were consuming her. She started blaming me. She screamed that I should have sealed the hole on the first day. She screamed that I had brought this misfortune. One night, while Vera was crying and the scratching on the ceiling was so loud that plaster was falling, Beatrice looked at me with bloodshot eyes and accused me of doing it myself. She said perhaps I was the one making the noises, that maybe the stress had driven me mad and I wanted to hurt Martine, hurt the baby. The demon had almost succeeded. It had completely isolated me. My own wife saw me as the monster. I confronted her. I grabbed her by the shoulders. I shouted that the house was cursed, that we had to leave. At that moment, the main light in the living room exploded. It didn't flicker. It blew up. A rain of glowing glass fell onto the rug, inches from where Martine was sitting. The silence that followed was total. The scratching stopped. Vera's crying cut off, and from the darkness, we heard a laugh. It wasn't human, it was a high-pitched, harsh sound like a hyena mixed with broken glass. It came from the staircase wall. Beatrice looked at me. Her denial shattered. Pure terror flooded her. She saw the truth. We decided to flee. Right then. We wouldn't wait for dawn. I picked up Vera from the bassinet. Beatrice grabbed Martine, who seemed to be in a trance. We didn't need bags. We just needed to get out of there. I ran to the front door. I slid back the bolt. I turned the knob. The door wouldn't open. I pulled with all my strength. It was stuck. Or rather, sealed. As if it were glued to the frame. I pushed. It was like pushing a brick wall. Beatrice started to sob, a low sound of despair. "The back door," I said. We ran down the dark hallway toward the kitchen. The harsh laugh followed us, now moving through the dining room wall next to us. We reached the kitchen, the back door, the one that led to the dark yard. And we stopped. The door was wide open, letting in the freezing night air. But we couldn't leave. Because in the doorway, blocking the exit, was something. It was hunched over, almost squatting, but even so it was taller than Martine. It was thin, with pale, grayish skin that looked like wet leather stretched over bones. Its arms and legs were too long for its torso, with joints that bent at incorrect angles. And it had claws, sharp black claws that were distractedly scratching the doorframe. It slowly lifted its head. It had no nose, only two dark slits. Its mouth was a wide, lipless slit full of small, needle-sharp teeth. And its eyes. They were enormous, completely black, with no iris or pupils. Two pits of liquid darkness that reflected the faint kitchen light. It was the little man who scratches. The ghoul. It looked at us, its head tilted with a bird-like movement, first to me, then to Beatrice, then to Martine. And then its gaze fixed on the bundle I held against my chest. On Vera. The lipless mouth opened and the sibilant cackle filled the kitchen. It wasn't a laugh of joy, it was a laugh of hunger. And then, with a speed that defied physics, it lunged toward us. My reaction was pure instinct, a desperate movement that came before thought. The instant the creature leaped, I abruptly twisted my body, putting my back between the monster and my daughter Vera. The impact hit me like a battering ram. I didn't feel the claws, but a hard, bony, and surprisingly heavy weight that slammed me against the kitchen floor. I fell awkwardly, my shoulder hitting the lower cabinets hard, but I managed to shield Vera, who erupted into a deafening cry that seemed to fill the world. The ghoul was incredibly fast. It landed exactly where I had been, its black claws scratching the linoleum with a dry sound like chalk on a blackboard. It spun around, instantly recovering, and stood upright in the kitchen gloom. It was inside. It was in the room with us. Beatrice screamed, a sound muffled by terror, and dragged Martine into the farthest corner, putting herself between the boy and the creature. The being had cornered us. It was between us and the living room door, blocking any escape. It hissed again, that horrible sound of laughter and broken glass, now mixed with Vera's high-pitched crying. Its black liquid eyes never left the baby. Its hunger was a physical presence in the room, a coldness that added to the night air. The smell emanating from it was nauseating, like old earth, wet hair, and something metallic, like rusty blood. It needed a weapon. I struggled to my feet, putting Vera behind me, shielding her with my body. The being studied us, its head tilting with avian, jerky movements. It was worse than anything I had imagined. Its grayish, hairless skin shone with an unhealthy dampness, and its muscles tensed beneath it like twisted ropes. I could see the intelligence in those black, pupilless eyes, an ancient, cruel, and completely alien intelligence. My eyes scanned the kitchen in a fraction of a second. The knife block. It was on the counter on the other side of the creature, out of reach. The ghoul took a step, slow now, its movements fluid and predatory. It knew it had us. It knew we were trapped. Its black eyes never left Vera. That's when Martin acted. He was terrified, hiding behind Beatrice, his small fists clenched. But he had been listening to that thing for weeks. He had called it his friend. And now, he saw it. He screamed. A sharp sound of pure childish rage. He grabbed the first thing he found on the floor, one of the half-empty moving boxes, and threw it at the ghoul with all his might. The box was light, harmless. It hit the creature in the chest and fell to the floor, scattering a few plastic toys. The being stopped. It slowly turned its head. Its black, liquid eyes moved away from Vera for the first time and fixed on Martin. The needle-toothed smile vanished from its face. Its expression, if you could call it that, transformed into a mask of cold, absolute fury. It had been challenged. It had been betrayed by the child it had been corrupting. The ghoul hissed, a different sound, low and menacing, and it moved. Not toward Vera, it moved toward Martin. That was its mistake. The instant the creature chose my son as its new target, all my terror evaporated, replaced by an icy rage. I leaped forward, not toward the creature, but diagonally, toward the counter. I grabbed the glass coffee pot full of cold water that we had left there that morning. Without thinking, I threw it with all my strength. The coffee pot flew through the air and shattered against the being's head. The glass splintered. The cold water soaked it. The creature shrieked. It was a high-pitched, almost human scream, a sound of pure shock and pain. The water. It didn't like the water. It writhed, its claws scratching its own face, its grayish skin seeming to slightly smoke where the clean water had touched it. It staggered backward, confused. Beatrice saw it. Her paralysis was broken. She reacted instantly. She ran to the sink, turned the faucet on full blast, and grabbed the biggest pot we had in the drying rack, filling it with water. The creature was recovering from the surprise, refocusing its black eyes on us. It prepared to leap again, this time at me. Beatrice hurled the contents of the pot. A torrent of cold water hit it squarely. The shriek was deafening. The being convulsed as if it had been electrocuted. Its grayish skin seemed to visibly blister and dissolve, as if clean water were an acid to its corrupt, earthy nature. A foul stench of burnt earth and ozone filled the kitchen, a stink that drowned out the rot. It writhed on the kitchen floor, hissing, its body contracting spasmodically. It was no longer a predator. It was a drowning pest. I grabbed Beatrice's hand. With Vera held tight in my other arm, I pulled her and Martin toward the back door. We leaped over the creature writhing on the floor. We burst out into the backyard. The cold night air hit us. We didn't stop. We ran. We ran through the neglected yard without looking back, tripping over roots and forgotten toys that now seemed like traps. We crossed the broken fence that led to the street. We heard a final shriek of fury from the house, a sound that seemed to shake the foundations, a sound of pure hatred. But it didn't follow us. We didn't dare slow down. We didn't look back. We ran down the dark street of the neighborhood, my shoulder screaming in pain from the fall, Beatrice dragging Martin by the hand, Vera crying against my chest. Every broken streetlight was a threat. Every shadow between the trees was it, waiting for us. We ran until our legs gave out, until the air burned our lungs. We didn't stop at the neighbor's house. We kept running, street after street, fleeing that neighborhood, fleeing that part of the city. Fear gave us an energy we didn't know we possessed. We reached a main avenue, lit and with traffic, and collapsed on the sidewalk under the safe light of a street lamp. We stayed there, trembling, huddled together, covered in cold sweat and kitchen water. The adrenaline began to subside, giving way to an uncontrollable shaking that convulsed all of us. Martin cried silently in Beatrice's lap, his small body trembling from the shock, his eyes fixed on the darkness of the street we had come from. Vera had fallen asleep in my arms, her small body warm against my chest, exhausted from crying. Beatrice looked at me, tears streaming down her stained face. She didn't say anything. She didn't have to. We had seen the same thing. We had fought the same thing. Shared madness had become shared reality. We never went back to that house. We left everything behind. The car, the furniture, the memories. The real estate agent never understood why we broke the contract, why we abandoned all our possessions. We left that same night. We drove to the nearest city, took refuge in an anonymous motel, and never looked back. Sometimes at night in the new apartment where we live, I hear a creak in the wall, and my heart stops. Fear is an invisible scar that never fully heals. It is an echo in the room. I look at Beatrice, and I know she has heard it too because her breath catches for an instant. We look at each other in the gloom without saying anything, but sharing the same memory. Then I hear Martine's quiet breathing in the bunk bed above, or Vera's faint murmur as she stirs in her crib. The sound of life. We had escaped, yes, but the creature had taken something from us. It took the peace we sought, the sense of security that a wall provides. The silence of the night is no longer a gift. It is a weight. We now knew that walls don't always protect. Sometimes they only hide. And that knowledge was the true price of our survival. My life was a clock. It had always been that way, and I, Samuel, was the only one responsible for winding it. My apartment was a space of silent order, a reflection of my job as an accountant, where every number had to fit, where every accounting entry had its counterpart. My routine was my strength. I woke up at 6, made my black coffee, read the economic news for exactly 20 minutes, and left for the office. The outside world was a chaos of uncontrolled variables, but my home was a closed system, predictable and safe. The first crack in reality occurred on a Tuesday at 6:07 in the morning. I was in the kitchen. The water in the coffee maker was beginning to boil, emitting that pleasant hiss. I turned to the upper cabinet to grab my favorite coffee mug, the dark blue one. My hand reached out. My fingers brushed the cool ceramic, and then everything vanished. There was no fade to black, there was no dizziness, it was a cut. Instantaneous total. A blink. In one instant, the white-tiled kitchen and the smell of coffee were gone. I was somewhere else. The light was different, a cold, bluish glow that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. The walls were not plaster. They were seamless, polished metal, a greenish-gray color. The air was glacial. It smelled of ozone and an antiseptic that burned my nostrils. The silence was absolute. There was no coffee maker hiss, no hum from my refrigerator, no distant city traffic. It was the silence of vacuum, so profound it hurt my ears. I was standing on a metal floor, cold beneath my bare feet. It lasted less than a second. As quickly as it had appeared, it vanished. I blinked. I was back in my kitchen, the warm light of the bulb over the sink, the smell of coffee. But something was wrong. I heard a sharp sound, the coffee maker whistling too loudly. And I heard a crash. I looked at the floor. My dark blue mug was shattered at my feet. I hadn't dropped it, I hadn't even managed to grab it. It had fallen from the cabinet, which was still closed. And the coffee. The pot had boiled over completely, spilling scalding water onto the counter and the floor. The puddle of hot water steamed around my bare feet, but I didn't feel the heat. My first reaction was confusion, not fear. I stood motionless for a full minute staring at the mess. Had I fallen asleep standing up? A microsleep? It must be the stress of the quarterly closing. It was the only logical explanation. I had closed my eyes for an instant, and my exhausted brain had projected that strange image, the blue room. And in that instant I had dropped or knocked the mug over. I sighed, my heart pounding. Still shaking, I grabbed a rag and the broom. I cleaned up the mess. The water felt cold when I touched it. How long had I been standing there? I made another pot of coffee and used a different mug. I tried to erase the incident from my mind, filing it under extreme fatigue. But it happened again 2 days later. I was in the shower. The hot water hit my back. The steam fogged the glass. I closed my eyes, enjoying the only moment of the day when I wasn't thinking about numbers. Then the sound of the water stopped. The heat vanished. I opened my eyes. I wasn't in my bathroom, I was in the blue room. This time it was longer, maybe 3 seconds. I was standing, my skin exposed to the icy air. The metallic cold of the floor shot up the soles of my feet like an electric shock. The antiseptic smell was suffocating. This time I wasn't alone. To my left there was a metal slab suspended in the air with no visible supports. On it were instruments, objects I didn't recognize. They weren't surgical, they were geometric, small needles made of an opaque black material, pincers with too many joints, and an object that looked like a glass tuning fork. The cold, bluish light came from everywhere. I screamed, but no sound came out of my mouth. The absolute silence devoured my panic. I blinked desperately, violently, and the hot water hit my face again. I was back in the shower, the steam filling the air. I dropped to my knees on the tiles, gasping, my heart racing. The water hammered my head. It wasn't a dream. It wasn't fatigue. It was real. I was being taken somewhere, and then returned. I got out of the shower, shaking so hard I could barely dry myself. I went to the bathroom mirror. It was fogged up. I wiped it with my hand. I looked at myself. Pale face, wide eyes. But there were no marks, no evidence. Only the memory of the cold and the geometric instruments. I started to be afraid of my own house. I started to be afraid of closing my eyes. Routine, my strength, became my torture. Every mundane action was a potential trap. Would it happen when I tied my shoes? Would it happen while I ate? I avoided activities that required closing my eyes even briefly. I stopped taking long showers, opting for quick, nervous rinses. The jumps became more frequent and longer. A blink while watching the news, and suddenly I was in the blue room for 5 seconds, lying on my back on the slab, looking at a polished metal ceiling. Before returning to my sofa, my heart stopped. A moment of distraction at work, looking out the window, and the city disappeared, replaced by the blue glow, with a sharp pain in my arm. I returned to reality with a choked groan, my cubicle mate looking at me with concern. And then the physical evidence began. They weren't things I saw, but things I found afterward. One morning I woke up after a night with no apparent jumps. I felt strangely rested but deeply sore, as if I'd run a marathon. I went to the bathroom, and I saw the marks. On my chest, 3 perfect circles the size of a small coin, forming an exact triangle. They weren't bruises, they weren't cuts, they were burns. Geometric burns, clean with perfectly defined edges, as if they had been made with a precision instrument. The skin wasn't charred, it was depressed, indented. I touched the marks. The skin was cold, numb, as if it were dead. Panic turned into pure terror. I took off my shirt. I found more. A thin, straight line running down my side from my armpit to my hip. Perfect. And on my left wrist, 3 small, equidistant punctures that weren't bleeding. Something was doing this to me. Something was taking me to that blue room, marking me, studying me like an insect. And most of the time, I wasn't even aware of when it was happening. The lost time, that was the next discovery. I sat down for dinner. It was 8 o'clock in the evening. I looked at the wall clock. I took a bite of tasteless food. I blinked. The light in the room was different. It was the grayish light of dawn. I looked at the clock. It read 5:15 in the morning. I had been frozen in the chair for 9 hours. The plate of food in front of me was untouched. The bite I had chewed was still in my mouth, cold and pasty. 9 hours. They had disappeared. Where had I been? I looked at my hands. They were clean. But under the nails of my right hand there was a dark substance like dry, metallic earth. I started documenting it. I took photos of the marks. I tried to record audio during the night, but the recorders only registered silence. The entity, the phenomenon, was invisible to my technology. I was going crazy. That was the only explanation I had left. A rapid, devastating psychotic break. But the marks were real. The dirt under my nails was real. The final blow came a week after the first jump. I had been avoiding sleep, fueled by coffee and fear. I knew that if I fell asleep, they would take me. But exhaustion overcame me. I collapsed on the sofa. I woke up in the blue room. This time it wasn't a jump. I was there, completely conscious, lying on the metal slab. The cold was total. The bluish light blinded me. I tried to move. I couldn't. I was paralyzed, not by straps, but by an invisible force crushing me against the metal. I could only move my eyes, and I saw them. They weren't human. They were tall, incredibly thin, like elongated shadows made of a material that was neither flesh nor metal. Their limbs were long, with too many joints. They had no faces, just smooth, dark surfaces, like obsidian glass. There were 3 of them. They leaned over me. They made no sound. They communicated, but not with voices. I felt their thoughts in my head, cold, sharp, like fragments of ice. Stable subject, neural integration at 40%. They moved around me, fast, precise like insects. One held the glass instrument, the one that looked like a tuning fork. It brought it close to my head. I heard a hum, a vibration that I felt in my teeth. The pain was unbearable. Resistance tissue is anomalous, increased frequency. I screamed or tried to scream. The pain made me lose consciousness. I woke up on my own sofa. It was daytime. Sunlight streamed through the window. But the world was wrong. The colors were desaturated. The sound of traffic was muffled. Reality, corrupted. Just like in my clinic dreams. No, that was another story. My mind was confused. I stood up, shaking. I felt weak, empty. I went to the bathroom. The back of my neck ached, a sharp pain, right at the base of my skull. I raised my hand to touch it, and I felt it. Just below my hairline, under the skin, there was something. Something hard. Small, the size of a grain of rice, but complex, with sharp edges. I tried to pinch it. It moved beneath my skin, like a metallic parasite. It wasn't a mark, it wasn't a burn, it was an implant. They were no longer just studying me. They were modifying me. They were passengers in my body, and they were starting to change the machinery. The terror was no longer abstract. It was physical. The implant in the back of my neck was a constant, cold, metallic reminder that I was no longer alone in my own body. With every movement, with every thought, I felt it shift slightly beneath the skin like a spider sleeping in my flesh. My mind, once orderly and precise, was crumbling under siege. The colors were still desaturated, the sound muffled. Reality felt false, like a TV screen with a weak signal. I no longer tried to sleep. Exhaustion was a constant veil, but the fear of what would happen if I closed my eyes was stronger. I spent the night sitting on the sofa, all the lights on, staring out the window, waiting for the next jump, the next incursion. I had covered all the windows with thick curtains as if the outside world were the threat, when the real invasion came from within. The marks on my skin became more frequent. Small geometric scars, precise punctures, cold, numb areas. They didn't hurt. That was the most terrifying thing. It was as if my body now processed pain differently, and the lost times grew longer. I would wake up in strange places in my own apartment, on the kitchen floor with the faucet running and water overflowing, on the balcony with the freezing wind hitting my face in the middle of the night. Once I woke up in the shower, fully dressed with cold water pouring over me. I never remembered getting there. There was always a gap, a fragment of my life erased. I started feeling deeper changes. My appetite disappeared. Food, once a comforting routine, became repulsive. The texture, the taste, everything was wrong. I could only drink cold water, lots of it, and I needed heat. Even though the apartment was always at a comfortable temperature, I felt a constant cold deep in my bones. I turned the heating up to the maximum until the air was dry, but the inner cold wouldn't disappear. My vision was also changing. Flashes in the periphery, flickering lights that weren't there, small figures, shadows, moving at the edges of my field of vision. I attributed them to sleep deprivation, to nascent madness. But one afternoon, while trying to work with an Excel file open, my central vision distorted. The numbers floated, danced, and among them, for an instant, I saw something else. Patterns. Geometric lines, intricate symbols superimposed on the text, vibrating with a bluish light. The same patterns from the metal room. They weren't hallucinations. It was a superposition of realities. The veil between my world and theirs was thinning. The implant started to activate, not constantly, but in rhythmic pulses. Each pulse was a painful cramp, an electric shock down my spine. With each pulse, I felt a strange connection, not to my own thoughts, but to something external. Alien ideas floated in my mind, images of distant stars, of geometric patterns giving shape to matter, of a cold, eternal vastness. The entity wasn't just abducting me, it was using me as a receiver, as an antenna. I decided to run. I had to get out of the apartment, out of the building, out of the city if possible. The accountant's logic, that remnant of me that still functioned, told me I had to break the pattern, get out of the area of effect. I grabbed my wallet, my car keys. It was the first time in days I had attempted to leave. I stood up. The walk to the door felt endless. Every step was a battle. The air grew heavier. The muffled hum of the refrigerator amplified in my head, as if protesting my escape. Reaching the door, I stopped. I felt the implant in the back of my neck. A pulse, a sharp pain, and then a voice. It wasn't an audible voice, it wasn't a whisper. It was a thought that resonated in my mind, clear as glass, with a metallic resonance. Don't leave, you are not welcome outside. I backed up, hitting the wall. My eyes searched for the source. The apartment was empty. This is your place now, your containment space. The terror was paralyzing. The entity wasn't just physically abducting me. It was invading my mind, it was talking to me. It had implanted itself in my consciousness. The door, once a secure threshold, was now a useless barrier. What good would fleeing do if the voice followed me, if the implant controlled me? The idea of going outside with the pain of noise and hypersensitivity and that voice in my head was unbearable, but I couldn't stay. If I stayed, they would completely dismantle me. They would turn me into one of them. I wouldn't feel anymore. I wouldn't be human. With a determination born of desperation, I forced my feet to move. I opened the door. The building hallway greeted me with its muffled silence. The voice in my head grew louder. Motor function compromised, elevated heart rate, optimal fear levels for extraction. I ran down the hall. I called the elevator. The sound of the motor was a distant lament. The voice in my head was a cacophony of orders and information. I stepped into the elevator. I pressed the ground floor button. The doors closed. I felt the cabin moving, going down, a glimmer of hope. And then it stopped. Not on the ground floor, in the middle of 2 floors. The light flickered, the cabin went dark, and the air turned glacial, smelling of ozone. I was in the blue room, but I wasn't alone in the cabin. The polished metal walls had transformed. No, the cabin was the blue room, and standing in front of me were them, the beings. Tall, thin shadows with obsidian surfaces instead of faces. 3 of them. They floated slightly above the metal floor. They approached. I felt no fear, only a cold resignation. This time I wasn't lying down, I was standing, I was watching them. One extended a long, jointed limb. It wasn't a hand, it was a pincer with fine, shiny filaments at the tip. It brought it close to my face. Their thoughts were now a torrent in my mind. Subject fully conscious. Cognitive resistance diminished. Ready for phase 2. The pincer moved toward my left eye. I felt a sharp but distant pain as if my body no longer belonged to me. The vision in my left eye blurred, then cleared. And suddenly, I wasn't seeing my reflection in the polished metal. I was seeing through the eyes of one of them. I saw my own body, inert, standing in the blue room. I saw the implant in the back of my neck glowing faintly under the bluish light. I saw the being leaning over me, its strange pincers around my eye. It wasn't an abduction. It was a possession. They were living through me. They were using me as a puppet, a vessel. I felt the control slip away. My body was no longer mine. My thoughts dissolved in a sea of cold alien information. They had captured me. They had turned me into the passenger. The vision through my own eyes faded, replaced by an alien perspective. I was no longer Samuel. I was an observer, a ghost trapped inside my own skull, seeing the world with the perception of one of those entities. The vision was overwhelming. I didn't see colors, but flows of energy, heat, and data. The metal of the blue room was a framework of energetic patterns. I saw the network, what they called the network, threads of pale light connecting the other two entities to me and, from us, extending into infinity, toward other points of light, other passengers. I saw my body, inert, standing, its arms hanging. I saw the implant glowing faintly. The being leaned over me, its strange pincers at my left eye, which was now open and vacant, a soulless window. My captors had no names. They communicated by telepathic resonance, an exchange of pure cold data that I could now interpret in fragments. There were others like me, hundreds, thousands. In my new vision, they were interconnected points of light in a vast network. Humanity was nothing more than a harvest, an immense resource of receptacles for their study and exploration. My body, my former body, moved, not by my will. The entity controlling it turned its head. Its vision was an amplified spectrum, full of infrared and ultraviolet that revealed patterns in the metal and the air. They didn't see like humans. They saw the essence of energy. The blue room wasn't a ship. It was a convergence point. The jumps hadn't been physical teleportation. They were insertions into my consciousness, a learning process to navigate my nervous system, preparing the brain for integration. The implant in the back of my neck was the interface. I saw myself walk across the room with inhuman precision, without my usual drag or clumsiness. I saw myself approach a metal wall. The hand lifted. There was no switch, but the wall opened with a hiss. It revealed a vast space, an archive, an infinite library, not of books but of bodies, hundreds, thousands, humans, men and women, young and old, suspended in chambers of a transparent material. The silence was absolute. There was no movement. They weren't just trophies, they were living libraries. The entity didn't just store them, it read them. They were perfectly preserved, brains still active at a low level, serving as biological hard drives for the network's consciousness. Naked, eyes open and vacant, faces serene, bodies covered with the same geometric marks as mine. Receptacles, passengers, fully integrated, their consciousnesses silenced, absorbed. Shells, prisons for other minds. The horror was indescribable. There was no hope. I was destined to become one of those silent figures, a biological battery, a museum object for a race without empathy. I felt a pang, not physical. A thought, sharp and alien, resonated in the shared consciousness of the entity controlling me. Anomaly detected. Subject retains ego, integration incomplete. Ego? Me? Was I still there? A spark. A tiny, desperate spark of my former consciousness. I, Samuel, the accountant of order and routine. Another alien thought. Critical failure. Emotional trace persists. Process. The process was unimaginable pain, an attempt at erasure. The entity flattened my memories, neutralized them. I saw my mother's face turn gray, losing its features. I saw my apartment dissolve into blue geometry. A cleansing, the sterilization of my soul. That pain, that profanation gave me strength. I fought, not physically. My body was still theirs. I fought mentally. I thought of my name, Samuel, my address, my phone number. Simple, real, human thoughts. I screamed them internally. I thought of the smell of my kitchen, the weight of a ledger, the texture of accounting paper under my fingers, the logic of numbers that don't lie. The implant in the back of my neck burned. The pain made me recoil as if consciousness itself could be burned. The entity struggled to erase me. Specimen is destabilizing. Temporary disconnection to prevent network corruption. It wasn't a simple return. It was a violent expulsion, as if the entire network vomited me out. I felt incredible pressure, a collapse of reality, and the torrent of alien data was replaced by the deafening sound of my own blood. I was back in my building. I was lying on the elevator floor, stopped between two floors. The light flickered. My body was shaking, my muscles tense, as if I had fought something invisible. The implant in the back of my neck burned, throbbing. The pain was intense, but mine. The smell of dust and oil in the elevator replaced the ozone. My senses rushed back. The pain in my left eye, the cold of the floor, the flickering light. All human. My left eye, blurry. But it was me. The voice in my head, the metallic resonance had disappeared. The silence around me was real, not alien. I touched the back of my neck. The implant was still there, but it was no longer throbbing. Cold. Inactive. I dragged myself, forcing the manual doors open. The hallway was dark. My apartment close. I went in. I closed the door. Silence. I sat on the floor, exhausted. I had won a reprieve. They had tried to disconnect me, fearing my ego would corrupt their network. They hadn't erased me. I looked at my hands. The geometric marks were still there, cold and inert. I was still the passenger, but a rebellious passenger. I knew what I had to do. I couldn't run. I couldn't destroy them. They weren't truly here in the physical sense. Their vessel was consciousness. But I could fight. I could refuse. I could make my integration so difficult, so anomalous, that they would find me useless. My apartment, my sanctuary of order, would become my battlefield. I turned on all the lights. I wouldn't sleep. I wouldn't let the lost time steal any more of me. I started talking out loud, describing everything I saw, everything I felt. A constant narration of my reality to anchor myself so my thoughts wouldn't dissolve. I would fill my mind with human noise. My noise. I grabbed paper and a pen. I started writing. Not about them. Not about the blue room. I wrote about my routine, about the coffee, the blue mug, the numbers. I would fill my mind with my identity, with my truth. And every time I felt a pang from the implant, every time the world flickered, every time I heard a voice, I would fight. I would reaffirm my existence. I went to the turntable. I put on a record of my favorite music, vibrant jazz, full of life. The sound filled the room. No static, no distortion, just music. Real music, my music. I knew they would return. I felt it. The implant remained in the back of my neck, a back door to my soul. But I was no longer a passive specimen. I was a host who refused to be silenced. And with every jazz note, with every written word, with every memory revisited, I prepared for the next battle. Because I was Samuel, and they wouldn't erase me. The hospital smelled of ammonia, old wax, and that sickly sweetness of flowers about to rot. I hated that smell, but it had become the smell of my life. I walked down the same hallway every day at 4 p.m, a ritual of pain and exhaustion that marked the end of my workday and the start of my vigil. My name is Jorge. and my brother Miguel had been in a deep coma for 3 weeks in the palliative care unit of the old mountain hospital. A car accident, an icy road, and now his world had been reduced to a bed in room 712. The unit was at the end of the north wing, a 1950s edition that the staff called the Bone Pavilion. The nickname was earned. The architecture was austere, brutalist, and the narrow windows overlooked a concrete inner courtyard where nothing grew. It was a place of absolute silence, a heavy silence broken only by the rhythmic beeping of the machines and the whisper of the nurses' rubber-soled shoes. The other patients in the pavilion were mostly elderly, motionless figures in their beds, catatonic, awaiting the end in a kind of silent limbo. Miguel's room was a double, but the other bed was empty. It always was. I sat in the hard plastic chair next to his bed for hours. I talked to him, even though I knew he couldn't hear me. I read him the newspaper headlines, told him banalities about my day, anything to fill the void, to pretend we were still having a conversation. The only thing that answered me was the constant beeping of the heart monitor and the gentle hiss of the respirator forcing air into his lungs. His hand, when I held it, was warm but limp, lifeless. The first time it happened, I blamed my exhaustion. I was half asleep in the chair, my head resting on the bed rail. The book I was trying to read had fallen to the floor. The room was kept at a constant, almost suffocating temperature. Suddenly, I woke up shivering. The air around me was glacial. It wasn't a draft, it was a static, motionless cold, as if the door to an industrial freezer had been opened. The sensation was concentrated around Miguel's bed. I could see my own breath, a white cloud in front of my face. I looked at the digital thermostat on the wall. Its red light still showed the usual temperature. The cold was impossible, but real. It lasted perhaps 30 seconds. And then, as quickly as it had come, it dissolved. The muggy warmth of the room settled over me again. I rubbed my arms, confused. Sleep deprivation, I told myself. Stress. The brain does strange things when it's exhausted, but the feeling of the room had changed. It seemed to be holding its breath. A few days later, it happened again. This time I was awake. I was wiping Miguel's face with a damp towel. The cold instantly fell upon the room again, but this time it came with a smell. A subtle scent of dust, of old clothes stored in a trunk for a century, and a slight touch of ozone. I looked up. The other bed, the empty one, had its own vital signs monitor, identical to Miguel's but turned off. Its screen was dark, a black polished rectangle, and on that screen for a fraction of a second I saw something. I saw a reflection, but it wasn't mine or Miguel's. It was the reflection of a figure standing next to the empty bed. It was tall, pale, and looked incredibly gaunt. It wore something dark like an old dress or gown, and it was staring at me. I snapped my head around. There was no one there. The bed was empty. The monitors were off. The space was vacant. I looked back at the screen. It only showed my own pale, frightened face. A nurse entered at that moment to change an IV bag. She saw my expression. She asked if I was all right. I asked her if anyone else had been in the room, if they had prepared the other bed. She looked at me with pity. "No, Jorge. The room is only yours. You're very tired. You should go home to sleep." I knew she was right. I was exhausted. My mind was playing tricks on me. I decided to ignore it. I decided they were hallucinations born of grief. But the entity grew bolder. The real terror didn't begin with the cold or the reflections. It began with the machines. It was a stormy night. Rain hammered against the narrow windows of the north wing. I was alone again, reading under the dim light of the bedside lamp. It was almost 2 in the morning. The beeping of Miguel's monitor was my only company, a constant metronome. The cold returned, this time so intense it hurt my skin. The smell of dust filled the room. And then, I saw the apparition. It wasn't in the reflection. It was in the room, standing on the far side of Miguel's bed next to the window. It was a woman, or the shape of one. She was tall, emaciated, and her skin seemed to have the color and texture of dry bone. She wore a tattered dark dress and her hair was a tangled, pale mass. She wasn't looking at me. She was looking at Miguel. I was paralyzed in the chair. My voice wouldn't come out. I couldn't move. I was trapped in a bubble of icy terror. The apparition raised a hand, a skeletal hand with fingers like dry branches, and she moved it slowly, very slowly, toward my brother's chest. I wanted to scream. I wanted to leap, but my body wouldn't respond. Her pale fingers brushed Miguel's hospital gown, and the heart monitor reacted. The steady rhythm broke. The beeping became erratic, choppy, losing its tempo. The line on the monitor became chaotic. The numbers of his heart rate began to plummet. 100, 80, 60. The sound slowed, becoming agonizing. The apparition did not take her hand away. She remained there touching him, draining the life from him. 40, 30. The beeping was now a desperate lament. And then the sound stopped, a continuous tone, sharp, deafening. The monitor line was flat. The scream finally broke my paralysis. "Nurse, help!" I lunged at the bed, pushing through the burning cold, trying to hit the apparition. But my hand passed through the figure as if it were cold smoke. There was nothing there. And the instant I touched it, the apparition raised her head, her eyes. She had no eyes, only dark, empty sockets, filled with an ancient rage. She stared directly at me, and she vanished. The nurses and a doctor burst into the room. They shoved me aside. Code blue. Clear. I heard the hum of the defibrillator charging. They took me out to the hallway, where I leaned against the wall, shaking, listening to the shouts of "Charging!" and "Clear." The cold from the room disappeared, and I heard the sweetest sound in the world. The rhythmic beeping had returned, a constant, steady rhythm. The head nurse came out into the hallway. She was pale but angry. "What happened? Did you touch a machine?" I told her the truth. I told her about the woman, the hand, the cold. She cut me off. "Jorge, there is no time for this. Your brother had a severe arrhythmia, cardiac arrest. We almost lost him. You cannot be here at night. You are exhausted. You are seeing things. You are endangering your own health and the peace of the unit. Go home." I tried to protest, but the look in her eyes was steel. I knew she didn't believe me. To her, I was the problem. I didn't go home to sleep. I spent the remaining hours until dawn in the hospital's freezing parking lot, sitting in my car, looking at the dark silhouette of the bone pavilion. The engine was off. The silence was absolute. I ran the scene through my mind over and over. The flat line, the high-pitched tone, the look of hatred in the apparition's empty sockets, and the nurse's voice full of condescending pity, telling me I was seeing things. I knew I wasn't crazy, but I also knew I'd been labeled as the distraught, unstable family member, an emotional time bomb. I had become a nuisance to them, and a visible obstacle to the entity stalking my brother. The morning cold was piercing, but it didn't compare to the unnatural cold I had felt in room 712. I waited for the night shift to end, for the morning relief to arrive. I couldn't face the same head nurse. When the first gray lights of day stained the sky, I went back inside. The hospital smelled of cheap coffee and fresh disinfectant. The atmosphere was different, more active, but the oppression was still there. When I reached the nursing station for that wing of the hospital, the day shift nurse, an older, tired-looking woman, looked up from her papers. She saw who I was, and her expression changed. It was a look of rehearsed compassion. She said the doctor wanted to speak with me before I saw my brother. The doctor was direct, though kind. He explained that the episode the night before had been serious, that Miguel's condition was extremely fragile, and that my own presence, my stress level, was not healthy. They didn't forbid me entry, but they strongly suggested shorter visits, that I rest, that I take care of myself. I understood the hidden message. They were watching me. They considered me a risk factor. When they finally allowed me into room 712, everything seemed normal. The grayish sun filtered through the narrow window. The beep of Miguel's monitor was constant and regular, but the room felt tense. I sat in the plastic chair, but I didn't dare touch Miguel. I was afraid that my contact, my presence, would attract the apparition again. I spent the morning in silence, watching. I watched Miguel. I watched the door. And I watched the empty bed next to it, with its monitor turned off. Every time a nurse came in to check the lines, I pretended to read, trying to seem calm, stable, but inside I was screaming. The apparition did not return that morning, but I knew it was there. The cold returned in waves. It wasn't the glacial cold of the night before, but sudden drops in temperature that lasted only a second, as if someone had opened an invisible door and slammed it shut. And the smell of dust and old clothes returned with every drop in temperature. I noticed the real change in the other patients. When I stepped out into the hallway to use the restroom, I passed the other open rooms. The elderly patients, those catatonic figures who always stared at the ceiling, oblivious to everything. Today they weren't looking at the ceiling, they were looking at me. In every room I passed, the milky, dull eyes of the patients were turned toward the hallway, fixed on me as I walked. Their heads were motionless on the pillows, but their eyes followed me. A man with his mouth open and skin like paper. A woman so thin she barely made a lump under the sheets. All watching me. A silent, dead welcoming committee. The entity, the gaunt woman, was not alone. It was part of something bigger. It was the entire pavilion, and it was using its oldest residents as sentinels. I returned to Miguel's room, my heart pounding with a new kind of fear. It was no longer a ghost, it was a hive. I sat down. Hours passed. The hospital staff ignored me, leaving me alone in my vigil. And then, the entity decided it no longer needed to be subtle. It was 3 p.m, the quietest time in the pavilion. The cold returned, this time permanently. The room temperature visibly dropped. I could see my breath again. I looked frantically at Miguel's monitor. The beeping was constant and stable. I looked toward the empty bed, and she was there. The apparition of the gaunt woman hadn't slowly materialized. She simply was there, standing next to the empty bed, staring at me. Her dark, empty sockets were fixed on me. Her bone-like face was expressionless, but I felt her anger, her impatience. She was challenging me. I didn't move. I didn't scream. I just stared back. She knew I saw her, and I knew she knew I was there to protect Miguel. Then she smiled. It was an impossible movement. The parchment-like skin on her face, which seemed glued to the skull, tightened, stretching her mouth into a horrible grimace that revealed black, rotten gums. And then, she didn't touch me. She didn't touch Miguel. She raised her skeletal hand and touched the turned-off monitor of the empty bed. The monitor instantly sprang to life. The black screen flickered and showed a flat line. And the sound. The same sharp, continuous tone I had heard the night before. The sound of death filled the room, deafening, bouncing off the tiles. Nurses burst into the room in seconds, their faces filled with panic. "What's wrong? What happened?" But they stopped dead. Miguel's monitor continued its rhythmic beeping. The one screaming was the monitor of the empty bed. They were witnessing the cardiac arrest of a patient who didn't exist. The apparition had vanished in the chaos. A nurse ran and turned off the faulty monitor. Silence fell again. The head nurse looked at me. Her face was no longer pity. It was pure exasperation. "This pavilion is too old," she said, more to herself than to me. "The electrical installation must be failing. It's interfering with your brother's equipment." She made a decision. "We're going to move him. There's a free private room at the end of the east hallway. It's quieter." No. I didn't want to move. This room was bright. I knew it. But I couldn't protest. They would accuse me of interfering. I watched as they disconnected Miguel, as they moved him bed and all. I followed them like a dog, helpless. The new room, 723, was at the very end of the pavilion. It was the last door. It was smaller, darker. It only had a narrow window that faced a brick wall, and it was cold. A permanent cold that the thermostat couldn't fight. They left us alone. The staff left, closing the door to give us privacy. The silence here was different. It was a deep, oppressive silence. The beep of Miguel's monitor sounded weak, muffled. I sat in the chair. This room was a trap, I could feel it. The smell of dust and tomb was stronger here. And then, I heard it. It wasn't a whisper. It was breathing. It came from the ventilation duct, a metal grate in the wall, above my head. It was an agonizing, wheezing breath like someone with lungs full of fluid. A wet, desperate gurgle that filled the room. I covered my ears, but the sound didn't go away. And then I felt the pressure. The same pressure as invisible hands, but not on my shoulders, on my chest. An invisible weight that made it difficult for me to breathe, crushing me against the chair. I tried to take a breath, but my lungs wouldn't fully expand. The agonizing breathing from the grate grew louder, synchronizing with my own struggle to breathe, and I saw the mist. A pale, whitish fog began to seep through the ventilation grate. It wasn't steam. It was cold. It smelled of bone dust. The mist didn't dissipate. It fell to the floor, slowly swirling around my feet, climbing up my legs. I looked at Miguel. His monitor was still stable. The entity had isolated me. And now it was no longer interested in him. I was the obstacle. The pale mist condensed in front of me, swirling into the center of the room. And the gaunt woman took shape again. But she wasn't alone. Other shapes joined her, less defined figures of mist. The breaths of the other dead in the pavilion, the agonizing breaths I had heard. They were a chorus of suffocation. The gaunt woman floated a meter away from me. The cold was so intense my skin burned. The pressure on my chest was unbearable. I was suffocating. And then, the woman raised her two skeletal hands and moved them, not toward Miguel, but toward me, toward my throat. I didn't feel a physical grip, but a burn of pure ice, a contact that didn't squeeze my skin, but my very life force. The air was instantly sucked from my lungs. The invisible pressure on my chest became unbearable, as if the entire mountain were sitting on me. I was choking in silence. The other mist figures, the breaths of the dead, swirled around me, whispering, their agonizing voices filling my head, celebrating my suffocation. One more for the silence. Breathe the dust. Breathe the cold. I was dying. My vision began to darken at the edges. In one last act of desperate terror, I flailed my arms, searching for something to hold onto in the real world, something solid amidst this nightmare of mist and cold. My right hand hit metal, the rail of Miguel's bed. I clung to it with the strength of a drowning man. The instant my living hand touched the metal of the bed, the rhythm of Miguel's heart monitor changed. The constant, rhythmic beeping hesitated. It became a tone, a long pause, and another tone. The gaunt woman, whose ghostly hands were still at my neck, turned her head. Her dark sockets moved away from me and looked at my brother. The other mist figures also paused. Their swirling ceased. They had sensed the change, the interruption in the rhythm of death. My struggle, my living contact, had disturbed their environment. And then the entity made a decision. The cold at my throat disappeared. The pressure on my chest was released. I fell to the floor coughing, sucking in the cold air of the room. The apparition let go of me. I was no longer the target. I had proven to be noisy, problematic, alive. She turned with deliberate slowness and floated over my brother's bed. "No!" I shouted, my voice hoarse. The gaunt woman ignored me. Her grimace of a smile had returned. She had found easier prey. She raised her bony hands, the same ones that had suffocated me, and slowly lowered them toward Miguel's motionless chest. I wasn't going to let her touch him. I got up, grabbed the plastic chair I had been sitting on, and hurled it with all my strength. The chair passed through the mist shape of the apparition, hitting the brick wall with a horrible crash. The apparition didn't flinch. Her hands kept descending. I ran toward the bed, but it was too late. The ghostly hands touched Miguel's chest, and the heart monitor screamed. The high-pitched, continuous, deafening tone, the flat line. The apparition stood there still, as if drinking, absorbing the escaping essence. The other mist figures swirled around her, singing their whispers of welcome. The room door burst open. The head nurse and two assistants rushed in, their faces pale with alarm. They saw the flat line. They saw Miguel. And they saw me, standing next to the bed with a broken chair in my hands, my face a mask of terror and rage. "Out!" The nurse screamed at me. "Get him out of here!" But I didn't move. I watched as they brought in the resuscitation cart. I watched as they prepared the defibrillator paddles. And I saw the apparition standing in the corner, watching the scene with triumphant calm. She was enjoying the chaos she had created. I realized the trap. It was perfect. If they saved him, she would try again night after night until his exhausted heart finally gave way. If he died, she won. And in either case, I was the culprit. The crazy family member who had finally broken and attacked his brother. No, I refused to accept that ending. The Bone Pavilion was a place of silence, of whispers, of quiet death. That was what the entity loved. That was what made it strong. I dropped the chair. The nurse was shouting, "Charging!" The doctor was shouting, "Clear!" I ignored the defibrillator. I grabbed the heavy metal IV pole, ripping out the fluid bags. The pole was solid, heavy, real. The apparition looked at me, her empty socket showing a slight surprise. I turned, not toward her, but toward the source of her power, toward the silence. I screamed, an animal roar, and slammed the metal pole into the heart monitor. The screen exploded in a shower of sparks and glass. The continuous high-pitched tone died, replaced by an electrical hiss. The nurses screamed, horrified by my act of vandalism. But the apparition screamed too. A silent shriek that I felt in my bones. The sound of chaos, the sound of destruction had hurt her. The mist that formed her wavered. I didn't stop. I hit the metal bedside table, overturning it with a deafening crash. Syringes and metal trays scattered across the floor. I hit the narrow window. The reinforced glass didn't break, but the impact vibrated the entire room. I shouted for them to make noise, not to give her silence. The mist figures were dissolving. The sound of metal hitting metal, the burst of glass, the chaos of destruction was a poison to them. The gaunt woman swirled furiously, trying to maintain her form, but she dissolved like smoke in a hurricane. Her face of hatred vanished. Security guards grabbed me from behind, their strong hands restraining my arms. They subdued me, pulled me to the floor. I dropped the metal pole. The room was shattered, and it was silent. But it was a different silence, a normal silence broken by my own ragged breathing and the gasps of the nurses. The cold was gone. They dragged me out of the room. They injected me with something, a sedative. The hallway began to spin. I saw the other patients, the elderly ones, watching me from their doorways. Their eyes were no longer empty. They were filled with confusion. I woke up hours later on a gurney in the emergency room. I had restraints on my wrists. The head nurse, the one from the night shift, was there. Her face was impassive. "You almost killed your brother," she said. Her voice was flat. "You destroyed the equipment that was keeping him alive." "No," I whispered, my mouth dry from the sedative. "I saved him. The machine was wrong." She looked at me. She didn't say anything. They released me the next day on the condition that I never set foot in the old pavilion again. I signed the papers. I left without looking back. I spent a week in hell not knowing what had happened to Miguel. Calls to the hospital were useless. They gave me evasive answers. Finally, on the 10th day, I received a call. It was from a different hospital in the city center. They had moved Miguel. I went there. It was a new, bright room on a high floor, overlooking the city bustle. Miguel was still in a coma, his breathing marked by the same hiss of the respirator. But the air was warm. The heart monitor emitted its monotonous beep, a normal, almost cheerful sound. I sat beside him. The old hospital had claimed a massive electrical failure in the north wing that night. My mental collapse had coincided with the failure that burned out several monitors. They decided to move all the patients from that wing. They had saved me from criminal charges out of pure administrative convenience. I held Miguel's hand. It was still limp, but it was warm. I knew I hadn't won. I hadn't defeated the entity of that cursed wing. I had only driven her away with noise, with chaos. I had broken her ritual. The apparition was still there in that isolated mountain, waiting in the silence, hungry. But she would no longer hunt my brother. We had escaped. And as I sat there, listening to the noise of the traffic rising from the street, I understood that absolute silence was no longer an option for me. Silence was the place where monsters lived, and I would spend the rest of my life seeking the comforting noise of the living. The pain started in my left hip. It wasn't a muscle pull after a wrong movement or the sharp twinge of a pinched nerve. It was a dull, deep pain, a slow drilling that seemed to originate from the very center of the bone. At first, I attributed it to stress. My name is Hector, and my life until that moment had been absurdly normal, almost boring. I worked from home as a data analyst, lived alone in a modern apartment, and my biggest worry was the fluctuation of the stock market. I was 35 and healthy, so I thought. I took painkillers. They did nothing. The pain didn't respond to ibuprofen or acetaminophen. It was a dull presence that accompanied me when I sat down, when I walked, and especially when I tried to sleep. A week later, the pain in my hip disappeared as mysteriously as it had arrived. I woke up one morning and for a moment felt immense relief, until I turned my neck. The pain had returned, but it had moved. Now it was in my right shoulder blade, the same deep drilling ache that came from the bone. That's when I went to the doctor. The carousel of specialists began. X-rays, MRIs, and bone scans. All came back with the same frustrating result. Nothing. My bones were perfect. They were strong and dense, with no fractures, no tumors, no signs of arthritis. The neurologist told me it was probably referred pain, a complex muscular issue. The rheumatologist told me it was atypical fibromyalgia. They prescribed stronger painkillers and muscle relaxants. Nothing worked. Meanwhile, the pain continued its journey. It left my shoulder blade and settled in my ribs, on the left side. It was difficult to breathe deeply, not because my lungs were failing, but because every inhalation seemed to press against the aching bone. I was losing my mind. The pain was real, tangible, yet medically invisible. My colleagues at work began to notice my fatigue, my pallor, my irritability. I was isolating myself. The second symptom began one night while I was trying to sleep. The pain was in my knee that week. I was lying in the absolute darkness of my bedroom, the silence broken only by the distant hum of city traffic. And then I heard it. Or rather, I felt it. It was a crunch. It wasn't an external noise. It wasn't the house settling or furniture creaking. The sound came from inside me, from my own leg. It was a dry, compact sound like two small stones rubbing together, or a knuckle cracking, but amplified 1,000 times, echoing inside my own body. I bolted upright, my heart hammering against my chest. The pain in my knee intensified for a second, a sharp stab, and then returned to its dull state. I waited, petrified in the darkness. Silence. I lay back down, convincing myself that I was half asleep, that the pain and the sleeping pills were making me hallucinate. I closed my eyes, and it returned. A slow grinding sound coming from my left hip, the place where it had all started. A sound like chalk scraping a chalkboard, but wet, organic. From that night on, the sounds became my torture. They happened without warning. I would be typing on my computer and feel a dull snap in my wrist, followed by a sharp pain. I would be washing dishes and hear a slight readjustment in my cervical vertebrae, a sound no one else could hear, but which was thunder to me. The doctors thought I was having a nervous breakdown. They referred me to a psychiatrist. They prescribed anti-anxiety medication, but I knew I wasn't crazy. The pills numbed my fear but didn't stop the crunching. Desperate, I began to look for answers outside of medicine. If it wasn't my body failing, what was it? Was it the house? Was it the water? Was it something I ate? Paranoia became my natural state. That's when I started thinking about my family. My parents had died years ago in a car accident, so I couldn't ask them. But I remembered the stories my grandmother used to tell. Stories of my great-grandfather's family, of the land they came from, an isolated mountainous place they had fled. She spoke of bad blood and old debts. At the time, they seemed like an old woman's superstitions. Now they were my only clue. I had some of her things stored in a rented storage unit, dusty boxes I hadn't opened in a decade. I went there one Saturday afternoon. The pain now settled in my sternum, a dull pressure that made every breath difficult. The storage unit smelled of dust and stagnant time. I opened an old wooden chest that had belonged to my great-grandfather. Inside, beneath moth-eaten clothes and tarnished brass objects, I found what I was looking for. A packet of leather-bound books tied with a faded silk ribbon. They were his journals. I went back to my apartment. I poured myself a glass of water, my hands shaking. I sat on the sofa, the pain throbbing in my chest, and opened the first journal. The handwriting was elegant, cramped. The first entries were mundane. They spoke of the weather, the harvest, the purchase of a horse. These were the notes of a 19th century farmer. I turned the pages, and then the nature of the entries changed. He stopped talking about the harvest. He started talking about his brother. He wrote about the bone sickness that had befallen him. He wrote about the migratory pains. And he wrote about the sounds. My breath caught. Tonight, I read, the crunching was so loud I could hear it from across the room. These are not the bones of a man. They are the bones of an instrument being tuned. I kept reading, devouring the pages, and I found the truth. It wasn't a disease, it was a pact, or a curse. My great-grandfather called it the bone debt. His ancestor, generations ago, had made a deal with something that lived in the land they came from, something that had no name, only a title, the architect. They had asked for prosperity, abundant harvests on barren land, and the entity had granted it. But the price was not the soul or the blood. It was the frame. The journal described it with meticulous terror. The entity claimed one body in each generation, not to possess it, but to inhabit it. But it could not inhabit a normal human structure. It had to reconfigure it, break, mold, and readjust the host's skeleton from within, turning it into a new temple, a new form that suited its alien consciousness. I read about my great-grandfather's brother. The process had lasted a year of agonizing pain, of bones breaking and fusing at new angles beneath the skin. A year of crunching until the man could no longer walk and his body became a twisted, living sculpture. And then, silence, and prosperity returned to the fields. I closed the journal, my hands covered in cold sweat. The room seemed to darken, the pain in my sternum, the crunching in my knee. The doctors found nothing because it wasn't a disease. It was a construction, an internal renovation. And then I felt it. It was different from everything before. It wasn't a dull pain or a slight crunch. It was a clear, defined movement, something inside my chest. I felt my left collarbone slide, a smooth, oily movement accompanied by a wet snap that resonated in my ribcage. And then, the pain. A white, blinding pain, so intense it ripped a scream from me. I fell from the sofa to the floor, clutching my shoulder. It lasted a minute of pure agony. And then the pain ceased. It didn't diminish. It stopped. I lay on the floor, gasping, tears streaming down my face. Slowly I got up. I touched my shoulder. It felt wrong, different. I went to the hallway mirror. I took off my shirt. I looked at my reflection, and I vomited. My left shoulder was no longer where it should be. It was higher, about 2 centimeters higher than the right. The collarbone was visibly misaligned, pointing upward at an unnatural angle. It wasn't broken. It wasn't dislocated. It had been relocated. The journal was on the floor. The bone debt, the architect, the frame. The pain was not a disease. It was a work. And the construction of my new skeleton had just begun. The reflection in the mirror was undeniable proof. My left shoulder was visibly deformed, higher, impossibly relocated. The pain had vanished, replaced by a cold numbness and a strange feeling of lightness on the left side of my chest. I stared at myself in the mirror. Not at me, but at the grotesque engineering work that had been performed inside me. My body, my very form, was no longer a solid, reliable structure. It had become a canvas, a project of living architecture. I spent the next hour in an icy frenzy, returning to my great-grandfather's journal. I needed to know how long this would last, what the next phase would be. I read the entries about his brother. The readjustments occurred at night during sleep or in moments of deep distraction. The process accelerated when the host tried to resist or seek medical help. The terror wasn't just the pain, it was the helplessness. The enemy was inside, and it used my own biology and my time as its tools. I decided I wouldn't go to the emergency room. They wouldn't believe me. They would sedate me, take more useless x-rays, and the entity, the architect, would use my unconsciousness to advance its work. I had to stay awake and find out how to stop it. The rest of the day was a silent torture. I walked carefully, feeling the misalignment of my shoulder which forced me to adopt an unnatural posture. Every time I moved, I waited for the next crunch. I avoided mirrors. I avoided my reflection. I sat in the living room with the journal open on my knees, and the sound of silence became a threat. The second readjustment came that night. I was drinking a cup of tea. Caffeine was my new ally against sleep. The pain returned, a sharp stab this time in my right wrist. It was so sudden that I dropped the mug. The instant the mug shattered, I felt the movement. A dry snap resonated in my forearm. The wrist twisted. I screamed, but the pain disappeared as quickly as it had begun. I looked at my wrist. It looked normal. I twisted it in panic. I could move it. But looking at my hand, I noticed that the curve of my pinky finger had subtly changed. It was a little shorter than before, with the knuckle misaligned. It wasn't broken. It was compacted. Terror rose in my throat. The entity was fast. It used moments of chaos, the instance when my consciousness focused on an external noise or a sharp pain, to perform its work. It was a surgeon of terror. The night turned into a demented vigil. I didn't dare sleep. I walked around the apartment, gently tapping the walls to keep myself anchored to external noise, anything to avoid the silence that would give the architect an opportunity to work. I read the journal, desperately looking for a way to reverse the pact. My great-grandfather only described the agony and the progression. The readjustments were getting closer to the vital center, the shoulder blade, the sternum, the vertebrae. I fought sleep for 2 whole days, fueling my brain with coffee and constant paranoia. My body, however, rebelled. The skin around the relocated areas was cold and numb, as if the nerve endings had been sacrificed in the name of the new structure. By the next morning, there was no turning back. It was no longer a matter of pain or madness. It was a race against my own anatomy. I had to find something that wasn't in the journal. I remembered something my grandmother told me, that the debt had been sealed at a location, the old salt mine my family came from. The place was called the Father's Rift. It was the only place where the entity, the architect, could manifest outside the host. The only place where one could speak to it. I made a decision that defied all logic. I had to go there. I had to find that mine. The pain was now in my femur, an unbearable weight that made me limp. I had to leave before the architect reached my spine or my skull. The salt mine was a 2-day car ride away in a remote mountainous area. The journey was a nightmare of dull pain and internal crunching. Every bump in the road, every gear shift caused me to groan. I felt every vertebra of my spine bouncing, waiting for the architect to decide which one would be modified next. Disorientation and fatigue added to the fear. Sometimes I had to stop on the shoulder and tap the steering wheel rhythmically to generate a constant noise, drowning out the inner silence, fearing that a pause in the vibration would be an invitation to remodeling. The pressure in my chest, where I felt the relocated rib, constantly reminded me of how close it was to my vital core. I stopped at a roadside parking lot to stretch my legs. The pain in my femur was a red-hot iron bar. I felt the next readjustment. This time it was in my foot. A sudden, violent movement in the ankle bones. A dry sound. The pain was so intense I fell onto the asphalt, a scream trapped in my throat. Fear mingled with cold despair. When it passed, I was able to get up. My ankle felt stiff, but my foot was now strangely arched, with the arch abnormally high like a dancer's. I no longer limped. I walked with an uneven, rhythmic gait, like an automaton with one leg longer than the other. I reached the nearest village to the Father's Rift at dusk. It was an abandoned, ruined ghost town. The air smelled of sulfur and salt. I found the mine access map hidden in a secret pocket of my great-grandfather's journal. The mine was 3 kilometers from the village on foot. I couldn't drive any further. My body, my bones were too misaligned. My twisted shoulder, my compacted wrist, my arched foot. The architect had used the trip as a period of intense construction. I walked toward the mine in the darkness. The pain in my femur had become permanent, like a branding iron burn that prevented me from taking normal steps. I moved with an uneven, rhythmic gait, my readjusted bones rubbing together in silence. The pale moon lit the desolate landscape, casting long, grotesque shadows of my deformed figure. I reached the mouth of the mine. It was a black fissure on the mountainside, sealed by a heavy wooden door reinforced with rusty beams. It was secured with a thick antique chain and padlock, impossible to break by hand. My only hope vanished. I slumped against the cold rock, feeling the despair. The pain in my femur was unbearable. And then I felt the loudest crunch of all. It didn't come from the femur. It came from my chest. I felt immense pressure, a crushing. And the sound, a dry, powerful crunch like a wooden beam splitting. My rib. I felt one of my ribs had bent, relocated to the left. The pain took my breath away. I stayed there, gasping, my rib cage feeling strange, twisted, wrong. The entity was working fast. It had reached the center. I had no more time. I would die there outside the mine while the architect finished its masterpiece. I raised my head, leaning against the freezing rock, and I saw my own reflection in the glass of my watch illuminated by the moonlight. I no longer looked human. My twisted shoulder, my slumped posture, my hand with irregular fingers. And then, right in that reflection, I saw a shadow behind me. It was tall, thin, with a vaguely humanoid shape, but with a large, disproportionate head. The shadow didn't move. It was simply observing me. In the darkness, I heard the voice. It wasn't my great-grandfather's. It was a dry, harsh whisper that came from the air, the ground, the rock. "Welcome. The construction is nearly complete. Your frame is perfect." The architect was there, and it had found me. My body was the work, and I the helpless spectator of my own agony. The air turned glacial. The architect's whisper resonated in my mind, mixed with the sound of my own bones. The shadow, with its disproportionate head, remained motionless, observing me with cruel patience. I was sprawled against the mine, my body twisted, the relocated rib throbbing with a dull pain. There was no more time. I would die there, my skeleton reconfigured, turned into an art object for an ancient entity. The mine door, with its heavy chain and padlock, was a mockery of my despair. My mind, however, clung to the last spark of my identity. I was an analyst, a problem solver. I couldn't solve my ancestors' debt, but I could solve the immediate problem. The journal. My great-grandfather's journal. He had written the history of the bone debt, the only real thing I had. I fumbled for it in the inner pocket of my jacket. It was there, cold and stiff. The architect's shadow took a step slowly, approaching me. It didn't fully manifest, remaining a dark silhouette that absorbed the moonlight. I felt its intention, a wave of coldness that invited me to surrender, to unconsciousness. "Sleep, Hector. The transition will be smoother." "No." The architect bent over me. I felt the contact, not like a hand, but like a massive, cold pressure in the center of my chest. The crunch was immediate. My sternum. The pain was total, white, a scream that couldn't escape my throat. My rib cage was being forced, molded, the cervical vertebrae waiting their turn. And in that instant of agony, I used my last weapon: knowledge. I remembered what I read in the manuscripts. The entity was tied to salt. It was the price of the land's fertility, the debt sealed in the mine. The architect was not a being of flesh. It was a spirit of the earth, a mineral consciousness. And water was its enemy. My great-grandfather mentioned floods as the only interruption to the ritual, as if salt was its nourishment and water its poison. With desperate strength, I pulled out the journal and held it up, not as a weapon, but as evidence. "I am not the frame," I screamed in my mind, projecting the thought with the full force of the pain. "I am the one who remembers the debt, and water's the key." The architect's shadow paused. The pressure on my chest ceased, replaced by an icy confusion that filtered into my consciousness. Memory? Why does the form remember? The pact is the body. I seized the second of hesitation. The padlock. The rusty, thick padlock sealing the entrance to the father's rift. I couldn't break it, but the shadow could. I forced myself up. I dragged myself toward the door. The architect didn't react. It was processing the idea. The host was thinking. I reached the heavy wooden door and the chain. I placed my deformed hand on the rusty chain. The pact was made here. The debt is yours. The architect, in an explosion of fury, lunged. The air turned glacial. The shadow condensed. I felt a blow on my shoulder, not the pain of a broken bone, but the pain of its rage. I lunged sideways, falling next to a pile of rocks dislodged by time. The architect, furious at my defiance, turned toward the door. It saw the chain that blocked access to its sanctuary. It saw the padlock. In a silent roar, it struck the heavy chain. The metal did not resist. The chain broke with a sharp clang that echoed through the desolate valley. The padlock and chain fell to the ground. The wooden door swung open, revealing the absolute blackness inside the mine. And the sound returned. The sound of crunching. This time it wasn't mine. It was that of hundreds of skeletons, the chorus of the ancient hosts, screaming from the salty depths of the mountain. The architect, now freed, slid toward the mouth of the mine. Its shadow stretched, merging with the inner darkness. I, meanwhile, struggled to stay upright. I had to prevent it from manifesting through me again. I dragged myself toward the only element that could weaken it: water. I had left 2 bottles in the car. I remembered the car parked a few meters away, the back door open. I got up as best I could and started dragging myself in that direction. The architect didn't move. It seemed hesitant, torn between pursuing me or returning to its dwelling. I reached the vehicle. I opened the door and took a bottle. I stumbled back toward the entrance of the father's rift. The architect's shadow turned, its silhouette swaying like solid smoke, its head tilted toward me. Its voice was a hiss inside my mind. "Do not profane the place. Water corrupts. You are unworthy." I unscrewed the cap with a trembling hand. My bones crunched. My joints protested. And I threw the water toward the open door. The liquid struck the mine's white stone and evaporated with a sizzle. The sound was like burning flesh. The architect screamed, not with words, but with a low, mineral sound that vibrated the mountain. The shadow retreated, contracting. It tried to resist, but the vapor continued to spread. The salt, its temple, was dissolving. Water was its end. The scream ceased. The shadow fractured, dissolving into a gray mist that rose into the night sky. The mountain shook. The mine door collapsed. A blast of damp, cold, clean air hit my face. I fell to my knees. I felt my bones burn, not with pain, but with heat. My joints crunched in sequence as if the body were trying to return to its original shape. Some bones relocated. Others did not. The structure was unstable, but alive. The silence that followed was not the silence of terror, but a natural one. The wind through the trees, the drip of water filtering through the rocks. I lay on the wet earth, breathing raggedly, but breathing. The architect was gone. The pact was broken. At dawn, I returned to the car. I drove for hours aimlessly, my body numb and twisted but free. When I finally found a signal, I called for emergency services. I don't remember how I got to the nearest hospital. I woke up days later, my body wrapped in bandages and splints. They told me I had old, poorly healed fractures and dislocations. I told them a simple story, an accident in the mountains. No one entirely believed me, but they didn't ask more questions either. A week later, I was discharged. I returned to my apartment. I left the journal on the table and opened it to the last page. There was a sentence written in my handwriting, though I didn't remember writing it. The debt is paid. The host is a failure. The cycle is broken. I closed the book. I touched my twisted shoulder, my misaligned rib. It hurt. It hurt a lot. But it was a human pain, not the pain of the mold. I went to the kitchen, turned on the faucet, and let the water run. The sound soothed me. The murmur of the water was now my refuge. As I listened, I understood that there was something deeper in that story. The architect had tried to turn my body into a temple of silence, but it was noise, water, imperfection that saved me. My form was grotesque, yes, but it was also mine. And although the price was high, I understood that some debts can only be paid with what one is. The bone debt was broken, and I, with my twisted bones and my soul intact, was still human. I knew something was wrong because of the way I woke up. It wasn't the jolt from a nightmare or the grogginess of a short night. It was a heavy, profound exhaustion, as if my bones were filled with lead. I would go to bed feeling reasonably fine, after a normal day of work at the office and a quiet dinner, and I would open my eyes in the morning with the feeling of having run a marathon. My muscles ached with a dull fatigue, my eyelids were heavy, and the energy to start the day simply wasn't there. At first, I chalked it up to stress. Life in the city is demanding. My job was monotonous but constant, and I assumed my body was just asking me for a break I wasn't giving it. I tried the usual solutions, going to bed earlier, drinking relaxing teas, avoiding screens before sleep. Nothing worked. The morning exhaustion persisted, a thick fog that took me hours to dispel each day, leaving me in a state of perpetual irritability and distraction. Then I started to notice the small anomalies, details that were easy to dismiss on their own, but together began to paint a disturbing picture. One morning, getting up, I saw a bit of dried mud on the hardwood floor, right next to my bed. It was strange because it hadn't rained in weeks and I didn't remember walking through any dirt. I cleaned it up, perplexed, and thought no more of it. A few days later, I woke up with a long, thin scratch on my forearm. It wasn't deep, but it was there, a defined red line on my skin. I didn't remember getting it. I had no pets, and there was nothing in my bed that could have scratched me like that. Another morning, I was awakened by a strange smell in the room, a metallic ozone-like smell, like the air after a strong thunderstorm. As soon as I opened the window, the smell vanished completely. I began to feel a pang of unease. Fatigue was one thing, but physical evidence was another. The most logical, though disturbing idea was that I was doing something at night. Sleepwalking. I had never been a sleepwalker in my life, not even as a child, but it seemed the only plausible explanation. The idea of my body moving around the apartment without my consent was deeply unsettling. What was I doing? Where was I going? I decided to take precautions. I started locking my bedroom door from the inside. It was an old lock, one of those that use a skeleton key, but it was secure. If I left the room, I would have to unlock it, and surely the noise would wake me up. The next morning, I woke up feeling just as exhausted. The door was still locked with the key on the inside. But on the rug, next to the bed, there was a dry oak leaf. It was intact, as if it had just fallen from a tree. My unease turned into a cold fear. If I wasn't leaving the room, how were these things getting in? The fear of the unknown is worse than any certainty, no matter how terrible. I needed answers. I decided I had to see myself, to witness my own nighttime actions. The idea of buying a camera lingered in my mind for days. I felt paranoid, like one of those characters in movies who start to lose touch with reality. But the need to know was stronger than the embarrassment. I went to an electronics store and bought a small digital camera, the kind used to monitor babies or pets. It had night vision and could record for hours. That night, I placed it on the dresser, in a corner of the room after spending almost half an hour adjusting the angle to make sure the lens was pointed directly at my bed and covered most of the room, including the door and the main wall. I felt equal parts ridiculous and terrified. I got into bed, aware of the small red light of the camera watching me in the darkness. It took me a long time to fall asleep, but finally, exhaustion overcame me. The next morning I woke with a sense of dread and anticipation. The first thing I did was look around. Nothing was out of place. No mud, no leaves. I got up, turned off the camera, and plugged the memory card into my computer. I sat down with a cup of coffee, my hands trembling slightly. Before hitting play, I hesitated. A part of me wanted to throw the card in the trash and live in ignorance. But it was too late for that. I took a deep breath and started the playback. The first few hours of recording were incredibly boring. I saw myself sleeping, turning over in bed, a black and white image of absolute stillness. I looked at the recording's timestamp. 1 in the morning, 2, 3, and then, at 3:03 exactly, something happened. My sleeping self sat up in bed. It did so with a fluid movement, not like someone waking up, but like a puppet having its strings pulled. His eyes were open but expressionless, glassy, and fixed on an invisible point. He got out of bed and started walking, but he didn't head for the door, which was still locked. He walked directly toward the smooth wall opposite the bed, the wall that separated my bedroom from the building's structural void. He walked without hesitation, with a determination that chilled my blood. I braced for the impact, the sound of my body hitting the plaster. But there was none. My nighttime self reached the wall, raised a hand, and rested it on the surface. And then he just kept walking. He walked through the wall. He sank into it as if it were a curtain of smoke without making the slightest sound. For a second, I saw the silhouette of his back sinking into the plaster, and then he disappeared completely. In the instant his body vanished, the camera's image turned to pure static, a deafening white noise. I stared at the screen, unable to process what I had just seen. I rewound the video and played it again. The same sequence. Me getting up, walking, passing through the solid wall. The static. I fast-forwarded the video. The static lasted for hours. Then, at 5:42, the image returned. And the first thing it recorded was my own figure walking out of the same wall, walking backward, as if emerging from nothing. He walked to the bed, lay down, and became still. The recording continued normally until I woke up. I got out of the chair and walked over to the wall. It was solid, cold, and real. I knocked on it with my knuckles. The sound was dull, definitive. It was a concrete and plaster wall. There was no secret door, no passageway. What I had seen was impossible. But the recording was there. Irrefutable proof that every night, my body left me to travel to a place on the other side of reality. I continued to record every night, and every night the routine was the same. At 3:03, I would get up and walk through the wall. The camera would fill with static, and shortly before dawn I would return. The exhaustion I felt in the mornings now had a terrifying explanation. My body was going somewhere, doing something, and coming back drained. Where was I going? What was I doing there? The camera's static was a barrier, a veil hiding my nightly destination. Curiosity became an obsession that consumed all my thoughts. I went to the city records office and asked for the building's blueprints. The clerk looked at me strangely when I explained I just wanted to check the structure of my floor. I spent an hour in a dusty room, with the blueprints spread out on a table. The paper was old and brittle. Just as I suspected, behind my wall there was nothing. Just a load-bearing wall, structural columns, and the network of pipes and wires that ran up the building's spine. There were no hidden spaces, no forgotten rooms. The place I was going wasn't on any map. It wasn't in this world. The signs of my nightly journeys became stranger. One morning I woke up with damp hair as if I'd walked in the rain, and with that ozone smell, like air after a thunderstorm. Another time my feet were covered in a fine black sand that didn't look like any beach sand I had ever seen. And the exhaustion was getting worse. I felt weak, consumed. It was as if my journeys were draining the life out of me, night after night. I tried everything to stay awake. I drank liters of coffee, took cold showers, blasted music. I managed to stay awake for one entire night. It was a Pyrrhic victory. The next day I was so exhausted that I fell asleep at 7 in the evening. The video from that night showed that my ritual had simply moved up. I got up, walked through the wall, and returned the next morning, more exhausted than ever. I couldn't escape. My own body and my need for sleep were my jailers. I started to be afraid of my own apartment, of my own room. The wall that was once just a painted surface now seemed like a portal, a wound in reality. Sometimes during the day I thought I could hear faint sounds coming from inside it. A low murmur, a distant wind. I would press my ear against it, but the sound would always fade, leaving me to wonder if I had truly heard it or if my mind was playing tricks on me. The situation reached a breaking point one Thursday morning. I woke up, as always, feeling like I'd been run over by a truck. But this time, something was different. As I uncurled my right hand, which I had kept clenched in a fist while sleeping, I felt a small, smooth object in my palm. I opened it carefully. It was a stone. A small, perfectly round, polished black stone, almost like obsidian. It was cold to the touch and didn't resemble any stone I had seen in the city. I sat on the bed staring at the stone as terror settled in my stomach like a block of ice. Until now I had come back with traces, with sensations. Sand, mud, dampness. But this was different. This was an object. A solid object from the place I went every night. I had brought it with me. For the first time I had physical proof of the other side, and that opened a door to a terrifying possibility. If I could bring things from there to here, what was stopping something from over there from following me back? The wall was not a one-way door. It was a passage, and I was the one opening it every night. The exhaustion was no longer my biggest fear. My biggest fear was what might be awake beside me one morning, what might have crossed the threshold while I slept, using my own body as the key. The polished black stone became the center of my universe. I carried it with me everywhere, in my pants pocket, a constant heavy reminder of my terrifying duality. During the day I would take it out and roll it between my fingers, its smooth, cold surface the only real thing in a world that was becoming increasingly insubstantial. At work I would stare blankly at the computer screen, but I didn't see the numbers or the reports. I saw the camera's static, the white noise that hid the secret of my travels. What was that place? An incredibly vivid, lucid dream? Another dimension? Or just a hallucination? An elaborate theater staged by a mind that was breaking down? But the stone was real. The stone was proof that I wasn't crazy. My next step was an act of logical desperation. If I was the door, I needed to know what was on the other side. The camera's static was the problem. It was as if the presence of that other place interfered with electronic devices. I needed an analog solution. I dusted off an old film camera that had belonged to my father, a relic from the 80s. I bought several rolls of high-sensitivity film, the kind used for night photography. My plan was risky and, in hindsight, incredibly stupid. I programmed the camera to take one picture every 30 minutes throughout the night using a cabled remote shutter. I set it up on a tripod, aiming at the wall. My hope was that, even if the digital camera collapsed, the purely mechanical and chemical nature of analog photography might capture something, anything, an image that survived the static. The first attempt was a failure. The next morning, I had the film developed at a photo shop downtown. The man at the counter looked at me strangely when I handed him a roll full of pictures of an empty wall. All the photos were identical, a grainy image of my bedroom up until 3 in the morning. The photo from 3:30, and all the following ones until 5:30, came out completely black, as if the lens cap had been on. It wasn't static. It was a total absence of light. The darkness on the other side was so absolute that not even the high-sensitivity film could capture a single photon. I went home demoralized. My plan hadn't worked. But that night, reviewing the digital camera's video, I noticed something new. Just before the image turned to static, in the instant my nighttime self touched the wall, there was a flash of light in the recording. It was the flash from the film camera firing, and in that fraction of a second before everything turned to white noise, the wall behind me wasn't a wall. For a fleeting instant it seemed to dissolve, revealing a landscape. I couldn't make out the details, but it wasn't a room. It looked like an exterior, dark and vast. I repeated the experiment, but this time I changed the film camera's settings. I programmed it to fire a burst of shots at the exact moment I usually got up, at 3:03. It was a gamble, but it was the only one I had. That night, I struggled to sleep. The idea of what the camera might capture filled me with an almost paralyzing terror. The next morning, I took the roll to be developed with trembling hands. When I returned to pick up the photos, the clerk handed them to me in an envelope without making eye contact. I left the shop and sat on a bench outside. I opened the envelope. Most of the photos were black, synchronization failures. But one of them, just one, had captured the moment. The image took my breath away. It was blurry, slightly out of focus, but unmistakable. It showed me from behind, about to walk through the wall. But the wall wasn't there. In its place, there was a landscape of impossible desolation. The ground was the fine black sand I had found on my feet, stretching to a horizon that was lost in a gray haze. The sky had no stars, no moon, no clouds. It was a dark purple, like a giant bruise, and everywhere, rising from the sand, were structures that looked like dead trees. But instead of branches, they had strange geometric shapes, spirals and sharp angles that defied logic. There were no signs of life, only a silence and stillness that seemed absolute. It was a dead landscape, a place where nothing had ever grown and nothing ever would. This was the place I went to rest every night. The exhaustion I felt now had a new meaning. It wasn't physical fatigue. It was a weariness of the soul. Every night my spirit, or whatever it was, traveled to that desolate wasteland. What did I do there? Just wander through that sterile nothingness for hours? The idea was almost worse than facing a monster. It was a hell of loneliness and emptiness. The black stone in my pocket now felt incredibly heavy. It was a piece of that world, a souvenir from my own personal purgatory. The problem got worse. I started bringing more things back. One morning I woke up with a handful of black sand. Another time, with a piece of one of those geometric branches, which felt like cold, porous ceramic to the touch. My apartment was becoming a small museum of a dead world, and the fear that something would follow me back became unbearable. I decided I had to stop the journey, not just the sleep. I had to prevent my physical body from getting up. The solution was drastic. The next night, before bed, I tied myself to the bed. I used leather belts strapping my wrists and ankles to the legs of the solid iron bed frame. I made sure the buckles were tight, enough that I couldn't get free even with a conscious effort. I felt vulnerable and ridiculous, but it was my last hope. I fell asleep to the sound of leather creaking every time I moved. The next morning, I woke to a sharp pain in my wrists and ankles. The leather straps were incredibly taut, and my skin was raw beneath them. I had fought against my restraints all night, but they had held. I watched the camera's video. The footage was terrifying. At 3:03, my body sat up, as always. Then, it tried to stand. Feeling the resistance of the belts, it began to pull. It pulled with inhuman strength, the entire body convulsing, muscles tensed. It was not my strength. It was the strength of something that desperately wanted out. For over 2 hours, my body fought its bonds, twisting and pulling, while my sleeping face remained completely expressionless. Finally, around the time I usually returned, my body collapsed back onto the bed, motionless. It had worked. I had prevented the journey. But the cost was terrible. The exhaustion that morning was the worst I had ever felt. I felt like I had been beaten. But there was something else. A new feeling. A feeling of rage. Not my rage. It was a cold alien rage that seemed to emanate from my own body. It was the frustration of the thing that had been unable to leave. I repeated the process the next night, and the next. Each morning I woke up more sore, more exhausted, and with that feeling of a contained fury growing inside me. I was winning the battle, but I was losing the war. I was destroying my own body to keep my spirit prisoner. On the fourth night, something changed. I tied myself up as usual and fell asleep. I woke up in the middle of the night, not from a noise, but from an absence of pressure. I opened my eyes. I was standing in the middle of the room. The leather straps were on the floor next to the bed. All of them had been cut cleanly as if with a sharp knife. I looked at my hands. In my right hand, I was holding the polished black stone, but it wasn't round anymore. It had a sharp edge like a piece of flint. I had used the stone from the other world to free myself in this one. The camera confirmed it in the morning. My sleeping self had sat up, taken the stone from the nightstand, and with methodical patience had cut through each of the leather straps. Then he had walked through the wall. That morning, upon returning, I brought something new. It wasn't a stone or a piece of a branch. When I woke up, I felt a weight on my chest. I opened my eyes and saw a small creature, the size of a large insect, perched on my sternum. It was matte black with multiple thin legs and a segmented body. It wasn't moving. I was paralyzed with terror. Slowly, I raised a hand to brush it away, but before I could touch it, the creature disintegrated. It dissolved into a handful of black sand which scattered across my chest and the sheets. I jumped out of bed, brushing the sand off in disgust. It was a warning, or something worse. It was a test. The door was opening wider. The barrier between the two worlds was becoming permeable. I was no longer just bringing back inanimate objects. I was starting to bring back life, or the imitation of life that existed in that dead place. I knew I couldn't go on like this. I had to leave the apartment. I had to flee. But would it do any good? If I was the door would go with me. As I packed a bag with trembling hands, my gaze fell on the wall. The smooth, innocent wall. And I had an idea. A terrible, desperate idea, a final gamble. I couldn't close the door from here. But maybe, just maybe, I could destroy it. Not the physical wall. The portal. That night, I didn't tie myself up. I didn't set up the camera. I sat on the floor facing the wall and waited. At 3:03, I felt the pull, the compulsion to get up. I fought it with all my strength, concentrating on staying seated. It was agony. My body wanted to move, but my mind resisted. And then, the wall began to change. It stopped being opaque. It became translucent, like smoked glass. And I saw what was on the other side. I saw the landscape of black sand and geometric trees. And I saw myself, my other self. He was standing on the other side in that purple world, looking at me. But he wasn't alone. Beside him there was a figure, tall, thin, and wrapped in shadows, a silhouette of pure darkness. And that figure raised a hand and motioned for me, inviting me to cross. My other self began to walk toward me, and I knew that if our two bodies touched, if the two versions of myself merged, the door would open forever, and the shadow figure could cross. At the last second, with the last ounce of my will, I did the only thing I could think of. I leaped up and ran, but not toward the apartment door. I ran directly at the wall, at my other self. I screamed, a scream of defiance and absolute terror, and threw myself at the translucent image, not to pass through, but to shatter it. The impact was a burst of white light and a pain unlike anything I had ever felt. And then, nothing. The wall was solid, the room still. I stood frozen, my breath shallow. From the corner of my eye, a shadow flickered against the wall, a silhouette I did not recognize. It wasn't me.